Hello everybody and welcome back. I'm Dr. James Waldron, a portfolio GP in Nottingham. I'm a GP educator, podcaster and co-host of the GP Notebook study groups. Welcome aboard the GP Notebook podcast. You can join us for a diverse array of bite-sized topics tailored for those in primary care. Perfect for your morning commute or anytime, anywhere. You can catch us on all leading podcast platforms. Don't forget to like and subscribe for updates on new episodes. And if you enjoy what you hear, please consider leaving a review to help others discover us. Stay connected with us on X at GP Notebook for podcast updates, study groups info and much more. You can also find me at Jamius Dodgers. Lastly, explore our new GP Notebook website for show notes and additional resources. Discover opportunities to join study groups and access a wealth of educational materials. Today, we're going to be rejoining Hayley Wilson, Consent and Sexual Violence Officer, for part 2 of this series on sexual violence. As with part 1, due to the nature of the topic today, it may be particularly emotive for some listeners. Please see the podcast notes for links to support and further resources. So, this is our second podcast exploring the very difficult but essential topic of sexual violence. In part 1, we talked about the cultural context of sexual violence and explored some of the work that's been done in universities to upskill people and understand the breadth of this topic. And we also learned about challenging our own beliefs and preconceptions. If you have time, have a listen, but today's episode also stands on its own. So, welcome back, Hayley.
Thanks, James. Good to be back.
So, we talked a lot about sexual violence as a whole before, but I'd like to focus today about sexual violence and disclosures in practice. So where should we start?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it can be quite scary, the prospect of receiving a disclosure, because, you know, you might think, what do I say if I say the wrong thing? How do I respond to this? And then, you know, that panic can sometimes come out when you do respond. And, you know, that survival victim may notice that. And it might lead you to saying the wrong thing. And I think that's another thing as well. We're all maybe a bit scared of saying the wrong thing and doing more damage. But that sometimes veers us onto a path where we just don't say anything at all. Mm-hmm. And so we'll go through some kind of what I find 3 key steps in responding to sexual violence disclosures, which is sort of listen, believe, and validate. But we'll go through that in a bit of sort of further detail later on. I think firstly we should kind of really think about who we might kind of get in that room, in that consultation room, and who might be disclosing. In the previous podcast, I spoke a lot about how there are barriers for victims and survivors to disclosing. And so the person that you may receive that's kind of giving you that disclosure, you know, has probably gone through a lot to get there. And, you know, you may well be the very first person that they've spoken to about it. But they may not look like what we think of a sexual violence survivor or victim as looking like.
Yes.
I think there is a big myth around who is the victim or survivor of sexual violence. And there's something that we call the perfect victim narrative. And we see this a lot in how we perceive sexual violence as a whole. And often we kind of have this image that sexual violence only happens to young, pretty women.
Yeah.
And because of that, people that don't fit that narrative may not receive an appropriate response when they disclose.
I think that's really interesting to hear, because I think that when we first started talking about this and we talked about the emotive nature of the word rape, I think that what makes it onto our screens, what makes it into the news, tends to be that perfect victim, as you talk about, you know, the stranger waiting in the dark alley. But I understand that it's usually not strangers waiting in dark alleys. It's a very different. But it's almost not the stranger waiting in the dark alley. It's the usual perpetrator in this case.
Yeah, so it is usually, I think 1 in 2 rapes of women are perpetrated by a partner or an ex-partner. So largely it is somebody known to the survivor victim that will, you know, perpetrate these kind of crimes. Mm-hmm. I also think it's really important to recognise that it's not just women that are victims and survivors of sexual violence. You know, men also are victims and survivors of sexual violence. And there is also a lot of barriers related to being a man and masculinity, which would prevent them from feeling able to talk to people about it and disclose. So I think all of these kind of factors are really important when, you know, that person may come into the room. And we really need to try and challenge that idea of a perfect victim or what a sexual violence victim looks like to ensure that we are responding to that person and every survivor in a kind of responsive and informed way.
I think that can be quite difficult to get our heads around in this context. We talked about in the last podcast about the very great breadth of sexual violence, from being grabbed in a club to, of course, rape at the other end, where we've been talking about. But it can be quite difficult to get our heads round other victims, and there's been some pretty high profile cases recently. Brings to mind is Terry Crews, who is an actor, a very tall and muscular fellow who in 2017 disclosed that he'd been sexually assaulted by somebody in a position of power in Hollywood, and that must have taken a huge amount of courage to bring out, because he's a very strong, muscular guy, and it's quite fascinating, quite harrowing reading about his experiences and the way he felt powerless to respond at that point.
I think it's really interesting that you use those kind of terms, strong and muscular guy, because again, that's that kind of subconscious narrative coming through there that only potentially weak women might be sexual violence victims. And obviously, that's not, I'm sure it's not something you believe, but it's the myth in society that's kind of perpetuated that men can't be sexual violence victims, especially not strong, muscular men, definitely not. And then, there's also that kind of narrative around people that look a certain way cannot be victims of sexual violence, when we know that they can, and they are. And all of those kind of subconscious judgments or kind of ideals that we have in our brains that maybe we don't even realise, they do cloud our responses. And it's really important to really challenge our own subconscious biases around that, I think. Similarly to Terry Crews, we also saw about Brendan Fraser as well, very similar situation in which he disclosed that he had also been victim to sexual violence from somebody in Hollywood. But I think it's really interesting in those cases that they talk a lot about the impact that it had on them. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when you are responding to survivors and victims, is that what you're responding to is the impact that it's had on them and how they're feeling in that moment right now. You're not there to be judge and juror for the crime itself.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting food for thought to just probe a bit more deeply in our consultations about what surrounds a person's disclosure, or perhaps not a disclosure. Are there any signs that we might pick up that we might look a little deeper?
Yeah, I think, again, one of the kind of main problems, I think, with a lot of people being able to disclose that they're a victim or survivor of sexual violence is actually whether they know it themselves. So, for example, you might find somebody coming in and they're talking about their relationship, and you might be picking up some things around the way they describe their partner. There might be some kind of emotional coercion. They may allude to things like, oh, they forced me to do this. I didn't really want to do it, but it's happened. Or they might say, oh, I went out last night, I was really drunk and I woke up and felt sore, but I think it's fine. All of those little hints and tips, that person might not realise themselves that, they have been subjected to sexual violence. Or maybe they do, and they don't know quite how to actually use the language to broach it, which is another thing that we find. People don't like to use the language because it feels scary and it's stigmatised. So I think picking up on those clues and those hints, if somebody's kind of feeling upset by something that's happened, but they're not really sure, and we'll talk about this in a second, but kind of allowing them that space to keep exploring it and saying, oh, okay, you sound upset about that. Did you want to talk about it a little bit more? Or that sounds like something that's impacted you quite a lot. Did you want to talk about that? And acknowledging that what they're starting to say might not be right. And then it kind of gives them the validation to continue talking and maybe have that self-realisation.
Sure. Okay, so, it sounds like at the very start of the consultation, listening is really key. It's and part of there's three things we were looking at there. So listen, believe, and validate, as you mentioned before. So listening's super important. One of the things that, as we've talked about this, and we talked a little bit about language, victim and survivor in our previous podcast, what advice would you give us about language used in consultations in sexual violence?
So I think the language you use is really important, especially in that very first disclosure, because as I've mentioned before, it might be that victim survivor's very first disclosure to anybody. So they may have not mentioned it to a single person before you. So again, previously mentioned, we spoke a little bit about why this is a problem in society and how we often look at the actions and the behaviours of the victim and survivor. And often we'll look at things like, why did you do this? Why did you do that? So that is the very first thing I would say to avoid. you are not there to be the juror. You're not there to kind of, prosecute a crime. You're there to listen and validate and believe. And part of that is not to kind of question the actions of that survivor. So if, for example, they say, I was out drinking late last night, I went home with somebody, they touched me, I didn't want them to, I told them to stop, but they continued. If the first thing that you say is, oh, well, why were you so drunk? You've completely just discounted everything else that they've said. And then they're going to think, okay, well, this happened because I was so drunk, because that's what, my GP is called out first. Or potentially, well, why didn't you walk away? Why didn't you fight them off? Again, you're putting the kind of focus on the victim survivor rather than the perpetrator. And that is something we see a lot with sexual violence cases, and not so much with other crimes either. It still needs to happen a lot more within sexual violence cases than other crimes, that you get such intense focus on the victim survivor behaviour and action. So language, really important, really try and avoid those why questions and questions around their general kind of behaviour and what they've done. You're there to listen, and if they want to, advise them and give them those resources that, can potentially help them in whichever kind of course of action they choose to take.
Yeah, that's really helpful advice. I think particularly from, I suppose, a general practice and doctor point of view, we've got to resist that writing mechanism, I've received a disclosure, I must try and fix this. Quite a lot of it is about listening and making people aware that their experiences are validated and that they're believed, and then helping link them into other things, other services, which we're going to go on to a bit. But I think it's quite difficult for us to resist that writing mechanism. We also talked a little bit about mental health's interplay with this, and mental health overall is probably something that the most GPs are much more au fait with and much more familiar with. And I think one of the things that we need to be quite careful of is to not discount these experiences in a form of going after mental health diagnoses or mental health support. You've made this disclosure, you must be feeling low. You've made this disclosure, you must be very anxious about this. And at least from our discussions before this, that's probably not the best approach. Yeah,
I think there's nothing wrong with acknowledging, and as I've said before, about validating, that mental health is a part of it. Of course, it's probably a part of it. Like it can impact your entire,
life.
Yeah. I think what the kind of point was around the discussion around mental health and sexual violence is, as you said, a lot of people feel more comfortable talking about mental health now. Like, there may well be a stigma still, but it's nowhere near as much as the stigma around sexual violence. So there can be a tendency to kind of drift towards that more comfortable subject. And I think it's really important to kind of refocus the conversation, especially if that survivor's come in specifically with, that disclosure of sexual violence, and kind of make sure that you are actually addressing that and validating that as well. So, they may well say what's happened to them and then say, I'm really struggling with my anxiety. Really try and resist the urge to say, okay, well, we can go to this service for anxiety support, because 9 times out of 10, that service will probably actually say to them, no, we can't help you. You need sexual violence support. That is kind of how I actually got into the field of sexual violence, because I was working a lot with mental health, and a lot of the patients that we were seeing for difficulties with anxiety and depression had been subjected to sexual violence, and we were having to say to them, I'm really sorry, like, all of your problems and all of the difficulties you're having are stemming from this traumatic incident, and we can't fix that with anxiety support. It's a lot, it's a lot greater than what we're able to offer you. But having, if they've been to their GP, they've been told to get anxiety support, they've then gone to the mental health service and then been rejected from that.
Yes.
The likelihood of them going to a sexual violence service after that is probably a lot slimmer than if it had been given to them from the outset. So I think it's very hard. I know as people, we're very solution focused. I think as GPs especially, we're very solution focused, but really try not to kind of jump into the comfortable that around mental health and, fix that problem. You're there in a way to kind of understand what the problem is around sexual violence and listen to that and let them guide where they want to go with it. And if it is support with mental health, fine, they, you can follow that. But if they've come to you with a disclosure around sexual violence and they want support for that, make sure that is actually what you're giving them.
Yeah. Really helpful framework to look at there. And I definitely sort of feel that wanting to move into topics that you're more comfortable with. It's sort of natural because you know that's a place you can help. And I think that you feel some of that helplessness when you're listening to a patient making disclosure that they're feeling, and you're like, wow, you don't know what to do. And we need, as health practitioners, we need to be more aware of what we can do, which is why I'm so glad you're here and able to help us with this today. So we just touched there on the difference between sort of anxiety, so IAPS and CBT support that we might offer people, but the differences between that and sexual violence support. What is the difference? What sort of things might they expect?
Yeah, so obviously with your kind of sort of typical mental health support, like your IAPS of the world, they are very much focused on looking at the anxiety or depression. So they will be kind of very solution focused and kind of trying to support that person in managing their anxiety, or maybe accessing further mental health support. With sexual violence support, it is a lot more specialised into actually supporting that person with the sexual violence and untangling all of those things we've always talked around the stigma that person might have, the embarrassment, the shame, in a kind of more counselling type setting. But that's only one aspect of sexual violence support. There's also what's called an ISVA service, and that is the Independent Sexual Violence Advocacy Service. Mm-hmm. So this is a national qualification that the majority of sexual violence specialist support services will have. And that person is able to support that survivor or victim with accessing the criminal justice process. So they can explain what will happen, how it works. They can accompany them to court so they can see it beforehand, because there is a lot of ambiguity in what that process looks like. People are scared of it. For obvious reasons, we see a lot in the media around, and I've spoken previously around, cases not actually kind of reaching conviction. That can be really scary. So having that person that is actually able to kind of talk to you about what you can expect and be realistic with it is really helpful. So they're kind of two in terms of the kind of more therapeutic type supports. A really important one, I think, especially GP and kind of health practitioners should know, is the SARC, which is the Sexual Assault Referral Clinic.
Yes.
So this is more of a medical model based support service, and they are able to take forensic medical examinations for victims and survivors. I think it's within a 7-day period of the incident. Yeah. Obviously, the sooner after the incident has occurred, the better in terms of being able to gather that evidence and kind of have better evidence, should I say. But they're also a really good port of call in terms of advice. I've spoken to, so the one in Nottingham, for example, is Topaz, and I've spoken with people that work there, and they are just fantastic, and they are always open for anyone to give them a call and just ask them advice about what they should do, whether they should refer somebody there, what their services are. Because the more that people know that these services exist, the more that we can support our friends, our family, our patients with really basic information and give them the tools to make a decision if they want to. So yeah, the SARC is a really, really great port of call, especially for advice and that immediate support. And they also kind of are able to kind of give advice around the police and support services as well. So they're a great organisation. And there are SARCs all up and down the country. It's not just Nottingham.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear that advice is there. So you mentioned supporting people through that process. So I suppose if a patient came in and said you made a disclosure and you explained it to them, what might they expect the process to be following that disclosure?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the first thing would be, this person's disclosed to you, and you may say, thank you. I think that's a really important thing, is actually kind of acknowledging this person's taken a really big step and disclosed to you. So thank you for disclosing. I understand how that can be a really difficult thing to do. I really appreciate you coming to me and telling me this. There are options available. There are support services that are specialising in sexual violence. Do you want me to talk through them? Is there anything in particular that you are looking for? Because you might find that person just wanted to tell somebody. They don't want to go further with it. Well, they may do in the future, but right in that moment, they don't want to go any further with it. They just want it to be out of their own brain and someone else to kind of share how they're feeling in. But they might say, I really want to access the police. And so you can then talk about things like the ISVAs, like I've mentioned. Nottingham has there's not sexual violence support service, and they have ISVAs, and they will be able to talk to you a little bit about what the police process looks like. Or you can go to the Topaz Centre, and they may be able to tell you a little bit more about that as well. you can discuss those services, but then, if you feel able to, you might want to give them a number for those services, or you leave them with the names of them and let them make that decision themselves. I think it's really important at this stage not to allow that victim survivor to have their autonomy still. That is something that has been stolen from them in the incident. And so giving them the information, allowing them to make the choice, but keeping the door open if they want to come back and maybe rediscuss those options.
Brilliant. I think giving some power back to the patient is so important after it's been taken away from them in whichever respect. And it sort of strikes me as we're talking about this, that we mentioned a death of 1,000 cuts in the last podcast, that it is quite probable that this is not the first time that it's happened. It's likely the culmination of lots of repeated assaults and exposures. So I'd quite like to end on what we might be able to do. So we've mentioned about the ISVAs, we mentioned about SARCs, which are all really useful things for us to know about. In terms of victim survivors afterwards, what sort of things can help them, I suppose, heal and feel better following sexual violence?
Yeah, I think it's a really big question because, of course, every victim survivor is going to have a different journey. Yeah. And for some people, it may be that they never want to talk about it again. And that might be their way of processing. And for others, it might be that they go to a specialist service, and it might be that they talk about it in a group and they have that shared experience almost in knowing that they aren't alone in that. And that's a thing that a lot of survivors often feel is very isolated in their experiences. So having that kind of community of other people that have been subjected to sexual violence can feel really empowering and, create that kind of togetherness in a way. We see a lot of kind of people that have been subjected to sexual violence that will then go on to be involved with kind of volunteering because they want to kind of feel empowered and also educate people about what's happened to them. And we see that a lot. You'll get a lot of specialist services that are actually run by survivors and victims because they're using their experience to empower other people and to help other people. So again, I think it's all subjective to the person. But it's also, making them aware that there are those options. Yeah. There's individual therapy, there's going down the criminal justice route. Some people find that very empowering and very helpful for them in their journey. Some people want to do group work, volunteering. Some people prefer to kind of invest in themselves and, maybe it's around they learn how to empower themselves, through their job or through creative means, taking up a new hobby or something. But again, as you said before, it's about giving them that autonomy and letting them know that there are options and there is the potential to heal. It can be possible.
Brilliant. So thank you very much. It's been a really fascinating talk. I think we've covered an awful lot today about what to do with initial disclosure to try and help us understand the language that we might want to be using to help people following that disclosure, avoiding the thinking about the perfect victim and just understanding the breadth of people that are affected by this problem and not expecting the perfect victim there, but also then looking to what we can do and who we can link people into and the services. So I think it's really nice that way that we can re-empower patients. So if you were to leave us with any bit of advice for this second part of our podcast here, what would that be? What would be your message to GPs and primary care?
I think I'm going to do two kind of main, goals or things to work towards sort of after thinking about this episode. One of them would be to practice not trying to solve problems. And you don't have to practice this, obviously, within your practice. At home, with friends, if someone comes to you with a problem, try and really practice not trying to jump in with a solution straight away and really try and listen. I think most people find it really difficult to actually just listen and just say, that's really rubbish, I'm sorry, and not then provide. You could try and really try and practice that, because I think as humans in general, we really struggle with it. And I think, again, in the kind of GP industry and health practitioners, we especially struggle. So that's probably the first one. I think the next one would probably be to have a research about what services are in your local area. There is Rape Crisis England and Wales, which covers most of the country, but you will have specialist services within your local area, which kind of would be very accessible if you wanted to speak to somebody. And also there are services for specific people. So there's Survivors UK, which is focused towards male victims. You also have Gallup, which is for LGBTQ plus survivors and victims. So you've got these really specialist services that are all available. And I think trying to get yourself acquainted with those and then the ones in your local area will be really helpful for you. They're probably my two main pieces of advice.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Hayley, for joining us again for this really, really helpful podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Hopefully we're going to get you back for one final time, or maybe more, but certainly one final time to talk about some of the more specific topics around sexual violence, particularly around image-based and around universities as well. So I really look forward to that. But thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yes, you too. Thanks, James.
So thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you found this podcast valuable. For additional information and links related to the episode, visit GPnotebookpodcast.com. If you found it enjoyable, remember to hit the follow button and perhaps leave a like and review. We have new podcasts each week. Connect with us on social media at GP Notebook and drop us an email if you have any questions, feedback or suggestions for future episodes. Why not revisit our revamped website to find out more about GP Notebook Pro and to enrol in our virtual GP Notebook study groups and access resources and tips aimed at enhancing patient care in primary care. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.